In the summer of 1976, 7 men crossed the Texas border after midnight, and none of them ever crossed back. No emergency calls were made, no bodies were found. By morning, the road they used looked untouched, as if no one had passed through at all. The crossing point wasn't official. It was a narrow dirt route used by workers, smugglers, and anyone who wanted to avoid questions. No cameras, no lights, just scrubland, heat, and silence stretching for miles in every direction. At night, the desert absorbed sound so completely that even engines felt distant. The 7 men weren't criminals. They were laborers hired to move equipment between sites on both sides of the border. Paid in cash, no contracts. The kind of work that depended on trust and ended the moment someone started asking who was responsible if something went wrong. They left just after 1 a.m. in 2 trucks. A third vehicle followed briefly, then turned back. That was the last confirmed sighting. By sunrise, both trucks were found parked near the border fence, doors closed, fuel still in the tanks. No signs of damage, no blood. No footprints in the hard, dry soil. Border authorities initially assumed the men had scattered. Maybe ran, maybe crossed somewhere else. In that region, disappearances were common enough to feel routine. But what made this one different was timing. All 7 radios went silent at the same moment. Not gradually, not one by one. All at once. A local deputy noted something else. The crossing log for that night had been rewritten, times adjusted, names removed. It looked clean, but too clean. Like someone had gone back knowing exactly what to erase. By the end of the day, families began calling. By the end of the week, those calls stopped being returned, and one question began forming in the background, never written down, never asked directly. If 7 men vanished without a trace, who made sure there would be nothing left to find? By the second morning, the border heat had already begun its work. Tire impressions softened. Wind erased the lightest marks. Whatever trace the men might have left was fading by the hour, yet no organized search was ordered. Border Patrol logged the trucks, photographed the area, and moved on. Families were told the men were likely delayed. Then they were told the men were not officially registered for crossing. Finally, they were told nothing at all. Each answer pushed responsibility further away, until there was no clear authority left to demand action from. A ranch hand working nearby mentioned seeing headlights off the main road around 1:30 a.m., more than 2 vehicles. He remembered because no one drove that route at night unless they knew exactly where they were going. When deputies returned later to take a statement, the ranch hand was suddenly unavailable. His employer said he'd left town. Inside border offices, records quietly shifted. Radio interference was cited. Logs were corrected for accuracy. A supervisor signed off on the changes without comment. Nothing illegal on its own. Just enough adjustment to make the timeline useless. Among workers who were used to crossing regularly, a warning spread fast. Don't use that road anymore. Don't ask why. Jobs were already scarce. Anyone pushing too hard found themselves replaced by someone more willing to keep quiet. One official detail stood out to investigators who bothered to look closely. The men's equipment had been unloaded neatly from the trucks. Nothing stolen, nothing damaged. Whoever intercepted them hadn't been after money or tools. They were after the men themselves. And beneath the paperwork, beneath the excuses, a single realization began to take shape. This wasn't an accident, and it wasn't random. It was controlled. And that raised the question no one wanted to pursue. If the disappearance was planned, who had the authority to make it happen at the border without consequences? 3 weeks after the disappearance, a mechanic from a nearby service station came forward quietly, not to the police, to a journalist he trusted. He said 2 trucks, matching the description, had been towed late that same night, hours before they were officially discovered at the border. The request didn't come through dispatch. It came directly from a man who showed credentials and didn't wait for questions. The mechanic remembered the detail that bothered him most. The trucks were clean, too clean. No mud packed in the wheel wells. No blood, no signs of panic. It was as if the vehicles had been staged, parked carefully, left behind on purpose. When the journalist tried to verify the tow order, the paperwork didn't exist. The service station's call logs for that night were missing a full hour. The owner claimed a system failure. Insurance covered the loss. The story ended there. A Border Patrol trainee later admitted he'd seen a convoy moving parallel to the fence line. Shortly after 1 a.m., not fast, controlled. 1 lead vehicle, 2 following, then a gap-like spacing meant to avoid attention. He assumed it was an authorized transfer and kept driving. That assumption was exactly what the operation relied on. What investigators never officially acknowledged was the geography. The stretch of border where the men vanished sat between overlapping jurisdictions, federal land on one side, private ranch land on the other, tribal routes nearby. A maze of authority where responsibility dissolved the moment someone tried to assign it. Rumors began circulating among workers that the men had been taken south. Others said they'd been turned around. No one said the word killed. In border regions, disappearance was easier to accept than death. It allowed everyone to keep working. Then the subcontractor who'd hired the men stopped answering calls. His office closed, his trucks were sold. By the end of the year, his business license was inactive. No charges. No investigation. Just absence replacing absence. And the pattern became undeniable. The men didn't vanish because no one saw them. They vanished because everyone who did chose not to look, which left one final, dangerous question hanging in the desert air. If silence was enforced so smoothly, how many people had to agree for it to work? By early 1977, the disappearance of 7 men had become a closed conversation. Not officially, there was no press conference announcing the end of the case, but functionally. Phone calls stopped being returned. Requests for records were delayed until they expired. Each agency involved learned to defer to another until responsibility dissolved completely. A junior federal investigator attempted to reopen the file after noticing inconsistencies in the radio logs. He requested raw recordings. He was told they had been reused. He asked for supervisor sign-offs. He was transferred 2 months later to an unrelated assignment in Arizona. No explanation was given. None was required. Behind the scenes, the border crossing itself changed. The dirt route was blocked with new fencing. Signs appeared warning of restricted access. What had once been an invisible shortcut was now suddenly secured, as if danger had only existed after the men vanished. Families noticed quiet interventions. Immigration questions disappeared. Outstanding citations were forgiven. One family received help relocating north, no paperwork attached. The assistance felt less like compassion and more like containment. Among border workers, an understanding settled in. Whatever happened that night wasn't to be repeated, but it also wasn't to be discussed. The lesson had been delivered clearly enough. Silence preserved stability. Questions disrupted it. No remains were ever found, no burial sites identified. The desert kept its role as the perfect accomplice, vast, indifferent, and legally convenient. And as months turned into years, the official language hardened into permanence. No evidence of criminal activity, no witnesses, no jurisdiction. Which translated into one unspoken truth. What happened was allowed to happen. Time finished what paperwork began. The men's names faded from memory outside their families. The subcontractor's company never reappeared. The trucks were auctioned. The road where everything ended became just another stretch of borderland, empty and unremarkable. In 1998, a retired border supervisor was asked about the case during a closed-door interview. He paused for a long time before answering. Then he said only this: some crossings were meant for people. Some were meant for problems. He refused to explain the difference. 7 men vanished overnight in 1976, not during a chase, not during a crime, but during routine work, following instructions from someone they trusted. That detail mattered more than any missing evidence. The Texas Border Night Massacre was never solved because solving it would have required naming a decision, not an individual. A moment where authority chose erasure over accountability. And borders are very good at hiding those choices. The men didn't disappear because the desert is dangerous. They disappeared because the system around the border was designed to make danger deniable. And that is why nothing was ever found, because nothing was meant to be. If this story made you question how easily people can be erased when responsibility has no clear owner, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Some truths don't vanish on their own, they're pushed into silence.